Hi everyone, I'm Tara Mont, and you're listening to the Trust and Thrive with Tara Mont podcast. I created this podcast along with my blog and brand to hopefully inspire others to live their most authentic life. I truly believe that we all have the power to live a life we love, and to do so, it's so important to be in tune with ourselves and be open to growing and evolving. I believe that once we can trust ourselves and our vision, that's when we can thrive. So with this podcast, I plan to discuss all things to do with self-reflection, personal growth, mindsets, and self-belief, all aspects that affect us in our everyday life. If you feel connected to my message and want to listen more often, I will be sharing one podcast a week, so make sure to subscribe and stay tuned. Welcome back, everyone, to this week's episode. It was such a pleasure chatting with this next guest, and I find this topic to just be so vital and something I think everyone needs to reflect on. So we touch on sexual self-awareness and anatomy. There are so many different topics we discuss, and before I get into more detail, I want to introduce the guest. Her name is Alexandra H. Solomon. Alexandra has a PhD, and she is the author of Taking Sexy Back: How to Own Your Sexuality and Create the Relationships You Want. That is her newest book, and she is also the author of Loving Bravely: 20 Lessons of Self-Discovery to Help You Get the Love You Want, which was featured on the Today Show. She's a clinical assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at Northwestern University, a licensed clinical psychologist at the Family Institute at Northwestern University. She's also a regular contributor at Psychology Today and an international speaker and teacher whose work has been featured on 5 continents. Alexandra lives in the greater Chicago area, and you can visit her at dralexandrasolomon.com, which I will include in the description of this episode. So that's a little more on Alexandra. We had such an amazing conversation touching on a variety of topics to do with sexual self-awareness, like I said, gender versus sex assigned at birth, cultural conditioning, the importance of self-expression and self-compassion, gendered roles and gendered stories, understanding the messages we've been given, and so much more. So this is definitely an insightful episode full of so much information. So I want to get right into it with Alexandra. I hope you enjoy this episode. I hope you're able to take something away and maybe have a new perspective that you didn't have before. So I hope you enjoy this interview. Let's get right into it with Alexandra. Hi, Alexandra. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thanks for having me on, Tara.
Of course. So can you start off telling us a little more about yourself and what you do? Because I found you through your TED Talk, and I know you have so much going on, so just want to hear from you.
Sure. Yes, I am. I'm trained as a licensed clinical psychologist, and I specialize in working with individuals and couples. So I basically have been studying love, sex, intimacy, and dating for a couple of decades now, and I do that work in the therapy office with my clients. I do that work in classrooms when I'm teaching graduate students how to do couples therapy at Northwestern University. Or I teach an undergraduate class called Marriage 101, a relationship education class. And then I do all the fun stuff of translating my research and clinical work to the general public. And that's through self-help books and blogs and articles and conversations with people like you. So that's really my what I live and breathe, is talking about love, sex, and relationships.
That's amazing. And I had the chance to read your book, Taking Sexy Back, and I really, really enjoyed it. And there were so many topics I connected to. And I'm just curious as to the inspiration behind writing your book and getting into this field. Do you feel like there wasn't enough relationship and sex education growing up for you? How did it interest you?
Right. So I think that I found my way into relationship work because I've been fascinated for a long time by marriage. And I think growing up as a kid in a divorced and pretty complicated blended family, I think that that whole topic of like, how do you make how do you make this work was really front and center for me. And then what I realized, so my first book is called Loving Bravely, and it was a bit of a more broad introduction to relational self awareness. So, what I like to do is help individuals understand what romantic relationships stir up in them, because what happens when we fall in love is it's really easy, or even when we're dating, it's really easy to get focused on the other person. Like, especially when we think about sort of online dating, we sit behind our phones and we swipe left and right, and we get very focused on the degree of interest we have in this other person. And that's all well and good. But the complicated piece is that when we are building a relationship, we've got to be aware and curious and compassionate with what gets stirred up in us, because all of our patterns and messages we internalize as kids growing up, like all that stuff gets stirred in our romantic relationship. So that's really the heart of what I do. And what I found after writing my first book was that I had a whole lot more I wanted to say about how stirred we get around the topic of sex, and how pretty inadequate, most of our sex education is in terms of preparing us for how incredibly complicated sex is. It's like this behavior. It's a thing we either do or don't do and enjoy, or kind of like feel like, what the heck's the big deal? But what we don't realize, or what we don't maybe think as much about, is how much who we are as people, as women, as men, as people, is kind of shapes what we feel like we can ask for in the bedroom. And so this book, the new book, Taking Sexy Back, is basically about sexual self-awareness, like understanding who we are as sexual beings. And the idea here is that the more I can understand myself, the better positioned I will be to really know where my boundaries are, to advocate for what I want and need, to say no to what's not feeling great, and to really create wonderful sexual experiences.
That's amazing. And I like that you touch on so many different components when it comes to sex and relationships, because when we think of sex education, we think of the anatomy aspect of it, or that's what we learned growing up, or safe sex and just the physical part, but not, asking for what you want and communicating your needs and all of that. So I'm curious as to your thoughts on how someone who doesn't even know how to explore their own sexuality, where can they start if maybe they've grown up in a more closed off environment or culture? Where can they go from here?
Yeah, well, I think you hit it just where it needs to be hit, which is just like naming, like, I don't know what, like, I deserve to understand this part of me better. Like, that in and of itself can feel rather revolutionary, can feel really scary, because in saying that, like in saying I deserve to understand this part of myself better, it is kind of pushing back against a lot of messages, especially for those who've been socialized as girls and women. I think we have this idea that like good girls really aren't sexually curious. They're not sexually hungry. They don't kind of crave pleasure and orgasm. That's kind of the stuff of like bad girls. So it may be that like just even that declaration of like, hell no, I actually am sexually curious. I actually do deserve to understand who I am, like what's my relationship to the world of the erotic, of touch and pleasure. And I deserve to understand that whole world better, and heal that kind of like split. I was at a book launch event last weekend, and a woman was in line, and she gave me her book, and she wanted me to sign it for her daughter, who's about 25. And she said, my daughter is just so like scared of doing stuff wrong in her life. She's scared of choosing the wrong partner. She's scared of choosing the wrong job. She's like, just can't kind of like feel comfortable in her choices. And I was like, I love that you're getting her this book, because even though this book is about sex, there's something about when we have a split inside of us, like there's just this whole part of me that I can't look at or think about or ask questions about or learn more about. It's like we show up in the world as not 100% there. And we think about sex, as I was saying before, like a behavior, but it really is this whole like energy of aliveness and passion and vitality. So if that part of us, if we don't feel empowered and entitled to that part of us, we're kind of like moving through the world as like a little floating head, really, versus a deeply embodied, entitled being, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. That completely makes sense. And I think that does connect to, in your book, I know you talk about, how women have been defined as passive and the object and prey compared to men who are, would be active subject predator. So do you think over time as a society and culture, we've done a better job at advocating for women to also use their voices, and not even just women, but everyone and of different sexes, genders, and not just, a heterosexual couple, man and woman? Do you think we've done a good job at that, or we have a lot to do?
Well, I'll answer this, but then I want to hear what you have to say about it too. I do. I think that there are definitely signs of progress, right? Like the fact when we think about, the Supreme Court's decision to legalize same-sex marriage in all 50 states, that's phenomenal. And that happened 6 years ago. So it's like, yes, it's amazing. That's beautiful. But that's really a blink of an eye. And so that means that all of us whose sexualities are anything besides, purely heterosexual, we have to offload that conditioning that somehow we are wrong. We are less, right? If somebody who's queer, has at some level been given the message that you are wrong. You are not worth all of the rights and all of the access and all of the love that somebody else is whose interests are, perfectly aligned in the heterosexual. So I think there's progress and a long ways to go. And the whole thing about, for those people who, for those who are heterosexual, I think that for men, we just now, I think men have internalized a lot of really problematic messages about who they need to be as sexual creatures too, right? This stereotype that men are always ready and always interested. It gets pretty confusing then for a man who is sort of like, no, I'm not. And it actually is pretty hard for me to be motivated to approach my partner. And I'm actually really pretty shy about my sexuality. So there can be shame there. Whenever the messages are loud, you should be like this, any part of us that's different than that is going to feel shameful. So I think most of us carry sexual shame, even if we grew up in a liberal, home. It was a sex positive home. I think there can still be these remnants because sex is so vulnerable. So I would say progress. I think the whole Me Too movement is a massive sign of progress, because if we can't name the pain and the violence and the misuses of sex, then we can't also name what we want, by saying this is wrong, this is problematic. I will not be ashamed of my trauma any longer. Saying that, declaring that helps us move to the next step, which is okay, so what's the world we want to imagine instead? Where do we want to go from here? And what do we need to be giving young people and, older people in order to move in that direction of something healthier, something more respectful, equitable, healing.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree, especially, I'm glad you brought up shame for men too, because women experience it a lot, obviously, but there's also that shame for men who, for example, there's so many men who have been sexually assaulted or harassed, and they maybe don't want to speak up about that because there's a stereotype that, well, you should enjoy it, or men probably enjoy it, or it's not harassment. And that's such a horrible thing to think about. But so many people don't enjoy their sexual experiences. And so I'm curious as to why you think people, whether they realize it or not, are not enjoying sex as much as they'd like to.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Well, I think in part it's what you're saying is a history of painful sexual experiences, hurtful sexual experiences, and the data shows that 1 in 3 women and 1 in 6 men have experienced some form of sexual violence. And for those of us who are survivors of trauma, trauma doesn't break us. Trauma disconnects us from our essence, our sort of innate connection to the erotic, to touch, to pleasure, to play. That's really powerful. It's, as I was saying before, it's our life force. So when we've survived a trauma, we can feel disconnected from it, but it's not gone. And so healing is oftentimes something that we do with the support of a therapist who is knows how to work with trauma. But there's also beautiful books and podcasts and body work that we can do that can also really nourish us and help us remember that that touch, when it's in a trusting relationship, can feel really good. And we've got a really nice resource guide in the new book of additional kinds of resources and tools. So that's one thing that can compromise. I'm not anti-pornography. I'm not anti-erotic materials, but I do think that we are living in a really different time around erotic materials where any one of us could grab our phones and be watching, really, really, really intense pornography within a matter of seconds. And so that is our reality, but we're not really equipped to deal with that reality, right? It's not part of, porn literacy, or being a conscious consumer of porn isn't really part of sex education. I remember it was maybe like 7 years ago now that I decided to talk about pornography in my Marriage 101 class. And I had like the whole offensive line of the Northwestern football team in the back row of my lecture hall. And I was like sweaty and blushing, but I was like, I am going to talk about pornography and about some internal guideposts, like how might one determine whether this erotic content is really elevating me and supporting my sexual health versus is this erotic content taking me to a place of kind of darkness, shame, where my erotic energy is getting kind of like siphoned off into this kind of darker corner, and then it makes it harder to show up for intimate, together, mutual experiences. So we talked about that, even though I was like, oh my gosh, I'm really nervous. And I never watched any of my teachers, talk about pornography. So, but it's one of those things. I mean, I think this whole book is a reflection of how important it is just to start the conversation, even if it makes us nervous. And so if there's a couple, for example, where they're having a really hard time talking about sex, or they're feeling like their sex life is kind of being neglected, it can be hard to start that conversation, right? Because we don't ever learn how to talk together about sex. And I address that in the book. And I think that the frame needs to be, I love us and I love being with you. I love being sexual with you. And I just wonder like how it is for you, and whether we might be able to talk about what's possible, what our growing edges are, what we each might be wanting or needing a bit more of, so that it's like framed in the language of positivity and connection.
Mm-hmm. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I feel like sex is a very sensitive topic, and it's something that a lot of people can take personally, or in relationships maybe think, oh, I'm not doing my job, or I'm not good enough. And especially when you compare it to porn, for example, which is obviously entertainment, but many people growing up, you see that as sex education if they're not getting the proper, accurate depiction of relationships and sex, and they're not having those conversations. So would you recommend, for example, if a couple or anyone in a relationship wants to talk about their sex life, is it better to do it outside of the bedroom, inside? Is there a preferred way, in your opinion?
Right. I do think that talking about sex while clothes are still on, is really helpful, right? I think once things get going, it can be a bit harder, especially like in a brand new relationship. There are lots of conversations that need to happen before clothes start coming off, right? Conversations about like sexual health and sexually transmitted infection status and boundaries, and how will I know if you're happy? How will you how will you check in with me? Those are all things we need to be talking about and clarifying like before things get hot and heavy. But for couples, if we're talking about like an established couple where they have been, making love for a while together, I think it is, I made a list in the book of all these different suggestions that I have just gathered from couples in my therapy office or couples I've met at talks I've given, and people get really creative. I met a couple who uses puppets when they talk about sex because they're just self-conscious, like sitting across the table and being like, well, darling, please pass the mashed potatoes and please also give me more cunnilingus because I really enjoy that. Like that can be a bit intense. And so this couple was using puppets, and it was a lovely way of like putting a bit of distance, between themselves and this topic in order to create more connection. So I don't really care how people do it. And people can do it through letters or through messages back and forth, or while they're taking a walk, so that at least there's a little bit less eye contact, perhaps. But as long as that framework is, I love you and I'm curious about you, like that's a beautiful place to start. And then if somebody's getting defensive, I want them to relate to their defensiveness with curiosity, right? Like if my partner's saying that they love me and that they want me, why am I feeling so freaking defensive about this? And I would guess that it ties to a gendered story they've been told. So if that defensive person is a man, what I'm guessing is it's this idea that somehow if he needs direction, if he needs feedback, somehow he's doing it wrong and he's a disappointment. And I will tell you what I know from 2 decades of working with men in my therapy office is how they look in their partner's eyes, right? How their partner is experiencing them matters tremendously. And they're deeply afraid of, and this is like, I'm making a sweeping gender statement here, but that is the nature of masculinity, I think, is we've socialized our men to just always have it figured out. And so for a man to need feedback, which of course he needs feedback because his partner's body is not his body. Even if his partner's body is another male body, his partner's body isn't his body. So of course he needs feedback, but that can really confront this idea that as a man, I need to have it all figured out all the time. And what might come up for a woman if she's feeling really defensive when her partner's giving her feedback is an idea, something that she's not somehow attractive enough or worthy enough, or that she's somehow it can trigger a ton of shame, right? The shame might be hiding behind her defensiveness, like a sense of just like, I'm just not enough here. And it could, I think one place women can go really easily around sex is to body stuff. I think to be a woman in this culture is to be sort of constantly plagued by messages about body and appearance and shape and, all this stuff that women are at risk of doing to themselves, that then feedback from their partner can really confront that. Like, here we go again, another way that I am not whatever, beautiful enough, attractive enough, sexy enough, hot enough, pleasing enough, caregiving enough, whatever. So my point here is in these conversations, when that defensiveness creeps up, because it probably will, to just like breathe with it and be curious about it and to really be gentle with like whatever pain point of ours is getting activated in that moment.
Definitely. And I think that also connects to the false idea that many of us grow up with, or that we just see in media of, the woman has to please the man in a heterosexual couple, for example, that sex is over when the man's done, and that it's not necessarily the woman has to be pleased every time, or we just see very inaccurate depictions of it. And so how important do you believe it is for men too, but especially women who maybe haven't been told or encouraged to explore their bodies and what makes them feel good? And so that when they're in a relationship or they're having sex with someone, they don't really know what even feels good to them. So how important do you believe it is to encourage that self-exploration?
I think it's vitally important. One of the things that I one of the things I found in my research is when Clinton was president, so like mid 1990s, so not horridly long ago, he had a Surgeon General, Dr. I'm not going to be able to think of her name. She was the first African-American female Surgeon General. And she was being asked about sex education. And somebody asked her whether or not masturbation should be taught as a part of sex education. And she made a really, really benign comment that masturbation could be included as an aspect of sexuality, basically was all she said. And she got fired from her job. like
Wow.
literally lost her job because she made a mild comment attempting to normalize masturbation as an aspect of sexuality. And that's the stew in which all of our sexual selves exist, which is deep, deep, deep fear of masturbation, of normalizing sexuality for kids. Like I think we don't. So um, point being that masturbation is in fact, especially for those who have vulvas, women, girls and women, it's a really, really like understanding your own anatomy is really, really important. And especially women who are going to be sexual with men, the heterosexual script has really put like penetrative sex as the end all be all. Like think about like on the playground when we're growing up, we learn about like first base and second base and third base
Hmm.
and the home run. So we sort of learn growing up that like the most sex you can have is penetrative sex, which is, first of all, completely obliterating the experiences of our um, queer people among us. But it also is somehow like holding that above everything else. And it turns out what the research shows is it's one of the less penetrative sex is one of the less orgasm producing sexual behaviors that a woman can be involved with. So it's like everything is set up for her to be passive, to be quiet, to prioritize a sexual behavior that probably isn't going to be her most orgasm producing one. So the chances of her having sex and being like, I don't know what the hell the big deal was with that, if she's having sex with men, are pretty strong. So she really does need to ground herself in intimate knowledge of her body, of how sensation rises in her body, of what feels good, about how she might be able to ask a partner for what feels good. And that's not something that is necessarily going to be taught to her, something she needs to claim for herself. I posted on Instagram last night a post about faking orgasms. The research is really clear that especially women who have sex with men are at pretty high, the incidence of orgasm faking is very, very high among women who have sex with men. And it makes total sense given what we're saying about social conditioning. But I was aware there was quite a bit of like reactivity on my Instagram feed because I think it's hard to talk about. It's a tender thing to talk about, but I think it's really important for us to notice the lengths we may be going through to kind of make ourselves small in the bedroom, to like not be real hungry, not be real centering of our own experiences in the bedroom.
Hmm. And so I know you talked about relational self awareness, but would you say that sexual self awareness is similar? Could you explain that as well? Because I feel like that ties into what you were just saying.
Yeah. So sexual self awareness is a curious, compassionate relationship we have with ourselves, understanding the messages we've been given, understanding the blocks that we have around sex, understanding where our shame lives. I think different people among us, their shame lives in different places. For some people, it was around religious messages. For some, it's around body messages. For some, it's around gender identity messages. So it's sort of like locating where does your shame live and what does your shame tell you, and how might you nourish a sense of wholeness instead. So that's what sexual self-awareness is, and understanding that it's not about basically like either performing in the bedroom or somebody else, giving you an orgasm. It's about understanding that the more we're willing to understand our relationship to the erotic, the better positioned we are to create relationships that feel really good, because relationship satisfaction and sexual satisfaction go hand in hand. The research shows that couples who have happy sex, who really can ask for what they need, who can cultivate an atmosphere of sexual health in their relationship, those couples are happier in their relationships and they're more likely to stay together. And that really like confronts this notion we have, I think, that this romanticized idea that if you love somebody, the sex is going to be good, it's going to stay good, and it's not going to be work. And if the sex is challenging, in fact, it means the relationship is doomed. And that's not really true, especially for sexually monogamous couples. We really need to be committed to like cultivating a sexual connection over time.
I'm glad you brought that up too, because I think a lot of people, once they're done with that honeymoon phase and that new phase, they think something's wrong, or they leave the relationship that can be a great one because they think that's it and they don't want to put in that work. And so I find that so important, the connection between relationship and sex, and it's so much deeper than just, this is what I like physically. And I was listening to a podcast episode with Esther Perel, who I'm sure you know, and she mentioned how in some parts of Europe, they actually have relationship education starting from the age of 4. And obviously it's different for each age group. Like 4, they talk about, you're going to like someone and you want to hold their hand, and then they just keep going. They talk about more things as the age goes up. So I find that so fascinating and interesting. But I want to know from your perspective the difference between going into now gender and sex, because one of my favorite parts of your book, which I completely agree with, is, for example, a gender reveal that many people have for babies, and how they call a gender reveal. It always has bothered me, and I've gone with it, but I completely agree that it's a sex reveal, a biological sex reveal, because you don't know who the child wants to be. So can you explain the difference between gender identity and biological sex for someone who may not know?
Yes, I definitely was on my soapbox on that one. It drives me crazy when people call it a gender reveal, because exactly what you're saying. Sex is what, is in our underpants, right? Biological sex. It's not even really biological sex. It's sex assigned at birth. It's whatever the doctor who brings the baby into the world declares, right? They see something that looks like a penis, they call it a boy. They see something that looks like a vagina, they call it a girl. So it is sex assigned at birth, because sometimes that's not even the best description. We would like sex to be binary, and it refuses to be binary. It refuses to be simple. And I loved on a recent episode of Grey's Anatomy, there were 2 pregnant physicians walking down the hall, and one of them said, "What's your baby's gender?" And the other one said, "It's not gender, it's sex." And so I like that Grey's Anatomy, as always, Shonda Rhimes finds a way to throw a little cultural education moment into her episodes. But yes, gender gender identity is sort of how we feel on the inside. So when we think about somebody who identifies as trans, right? It's the body that they have on the outside isn't aligned with how they experience themselves and identify on the inside. So one of the things we do in the Taking Sexy Back book is a genderbread. You can Google genderbread person, or there's a newer one called the gender unicorn, where you can sort of tease apart for yourself the distinction between the sex that you were assigned at birth, and gender identity, and then gender expression, which is how your dress and your voice and your hair and your presentation, whether that skews more masculine or more feminine, at least skews towards what our culture would label masculine or feminine, and then romantic attraction and sexual attraction. Because we also kind of limit sexual orientation, don't we? We say that you're either gay or straight or bi, when in reality there are other nuances towards where our attraction towards others may go. And so it's all a bit more complicated than we like to think that it is. And having language around it can be helpful in normalizing that we all could use some more boxes to kind of to characterize and capture where we are related to these ideas of what our culture calls masculine and feminine.
And even just the expectations that we place on someone or a child that isn't even born yet, or that can't even make their own decisions, simply from just the colors that we portray, the pink and the blue, or, we give them dolls, or we say, this boy is really handsome and strong, or this girl is really cute and sweet. Just these little things we don't realize really affect someone growing up. And so that's something I try to think about in the future when I have children, and giving them that space to figure that out on their own and not putting any specific pressure on them. So how important do you believe it is for people now to educate themselves on all these different topics and aspects, so that in the future, we can maybe stop this very binary idea of what it is to be a man, woman, or we think sexuality is so limited?
Right. Well, I love what you're saying about sort of how, being aware of how subtle this stuff is. Because it doesn't, when I sometimes am asked to speak about like gender neutral parenting, and it doesn't mean that I think it's fine to raise our children as boys and as girls if that, but we need to be aware that to be a boy is to be allowed to be drawn to whatever, right? To be drawn to dolls because there's a whole set of skills and parts of the brain that we grow and cultivate by playing with dolls, right? The relational, the nurturing, the caregiving. My gosh, do we need a world of boys who are supported in empathy and caregiving and nurturing? And then to allow our girls to play with trucks and to build, because there's a whole set of what gets kind of wired up in the brain around those things that are a bit more agentic, right? Working with agency about kind of acting on stuff and doing stuff and putting stuff together. So that really is, to me, what gender neutral parenting is really allowing our children, all of our children, to have a full range of interests and access to a full range of emotions. And it's not going to be, I think we still are going to get triggered. Like we may have an urge to tell our little boy to stop crying, but we can notice that we're having that urge. We can catch ourselves and we can close our mouths and we can hold him instead of telling him to stop, to stop crying. And we can notice that it's hard for us to watch our girl be really, really demanding because we have a particular notion that gets kicked up in us about what happens to demanding girls. And we can notice that and we can quiet ourselves down and we can honor that she's using her voice. So I don't know that we ever get beyond the messages we've been given, but we can get better and better at noticing that our own cultural conditioning is getting activated, and we can pause and make a different choice in that moment to just give our kids a wider range of expression than perhaps we were given. And there's something very, very lovely and full circle about that, giving our kids something that we weren't given. It's very, very beautiful to see that in practice.
Mm-hmm. And I'm so glad you mentioned just the fact of being aware of that because, no one's perfect. And I've had many judgments that I didn't even realize were from beliefs growing up, and to just stop yourself. And I think overall, the theme that I appreciate is that self-awareness, because once you have it, you can also have that relational awareness and be aware of what you're saying to your kids and people around you. And so to do that, instead of passing on maybe generational trauma or beliefs that you don't want passed down. Girls, for example, if girls are tomboys in quotes and they're strong or they're playing sports, then they may get praised for it or seem cool. But if a little boy is playing with dolls or doing something that stereotypically is something a young girl would do, then they might be called really hurtful names and be shamed for it. And so do you think that relates to the fact that men, at the end of the day, with the patriarchy, they've been just told to own all their masculine aspects and that being feminine is less worthy?
Yes. And when we talk about patriarchy, it's not anything that any one man does to anybody else. It's a system, right? It's a really, really macro system that goes back thousands and thousands of years that really prioritizes hierarchy and devalues difference, right? We are really at risk, whether it's around gender, race, socioeconomic status, religion. We are really at risk of taking a difference and making it into a hierarchy. And that's the nature of patriarchy, is kind of ownership and a positionality that is one up, one down. It's a system that does that around any given variable. And so what can get confusing then is when we watch men sort of play that out among other men. It's actually called like hegemonic masculinity, this idea that there's a hierarchy of sort of positioning men as more powerful than women, certainly. But then even among men, it's sort of like this, we see it with Donald Trump, right? When he's sort of shaming men who are shorter than him, or shaming men who, he calls Adam Schiff like a pencil neck, sort of that like hegemonic positioning of needing to have power over other men. We watch it around between straight men and gay men, or white men and men of color, or rich men and poorer men. So there's ways in which it's just sort of everything becomes hierarchical, and that positionality is if you're not one up, then you're one down. And whatever is one down is held in contempt. And that's what we see with around the feminine, right? Sort of holding the feminine in contempt. And it's no coincidence then that when a man wants to shame another man as being less than, he oftentimes will go to a word that's tied to the feminine, right? He'll call him, call him a pussy. He'll call him a cunt, right? He'll call him a douchebag, like these things that are sort of tied to the feminine in a way that is, again, no, a man who calls another man a pussy he didn't create that, but he is certainly has inherited multiple generations of holding the feminine in contempt in an effort to maintain dominance, right? It's just like kind of replicating that, playing it out. And so, and whenever any of us go to that place of wanting to sort of be powerful over another, it's another one of those moments to be like, okay, what's going on in me? Like, what's stirring up in me? What am I afraid of? What is the privilege I'm, afraid of losing? What's the in what ways has my privilege blinded me to the experiences of others? On and on. But all that, it's just all that stuff plays out and comes into the bedroom with us, right? Like, I think that that's one of the challenges of being a man and being sexual is this idea of like, if you've been told you have to always be dominant, what the hell are you going to do in the bedroom then? Like, how do you then make space to honor the experience of another person in the bedroom if you've been told your whole life that you have to just be dominant, lead the way, don't ask questions? It becomes incredibly problematic.
Definitely. I agree. And it's so important to reflect on that, because I think that also really affects the LGBTQ plus community, because if they were raised in an environment where they're only told a man is like this, a woman is like this, and then they're in a relationship with the same sex, they may not know how to deal with that without feeling that shame, which is really unfortunate, but it's something as a culture, hopefully, we're learning over time. And so I want to go a little back and ask you about the difference between being sexual and being sexualized, because I think a lot of people can use those hand in hand, but I want to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's the difference between subject and object. And I think this is especially something that that women experience. So to be sexualized is the experience of somebody else having a judgment, an opinion, or a reaction to how we are showing up in the world. So the title of the book, right, is Taking Sexy Back. So sexy is one of those words that kind of grows from that space of sexualized. So I think a really nice place of self-inquiry is for a woman to kind of consider, like, what's my relationship with that word sexy? Like, how do I feel about that word? In what context have I felt entitled to that word? In what context have I felt like that word is really not for me? And I think that in general, women can feel like sexy is a question, right? It's sort of like, do you think I'm sexy? Do you find me sexy? And that can either be like, please, please, please find me sexy, or it can be like, oh shit, I'm really afraid that you find me sexy, and what am I going to do about that? But it is sort of something that's like an awareness of how I look in your gaze. And it can be something that then becomes so front and center that I can't tap into being sexual, because being sexual is this idea that my sexuality actually is located within me, and it is tapped into by me. I can figure out what helps me feel sexual, what cuts me off from being sexual, what are the conditions in which I really crave being sexual, what are the conditions in which I really don't want to be sexual. But that idea of like agency, that it's located within me and it's mine to figure out. It's why I was really reactive to people having any opinions about J-Lo and Shakira and the half.
Yes.
Right? It's sort of like enough of this, everybody feeling entitled to comment on women's expression of their connection to the erotic, right? It just is like enough of that, kind of entitlement to comment or weigh in on.
Yeah. And it's funny too, because the year before, Adam Levine was shirtless the whole time and no one complained about that.
That's right.
But when it's that, it's so interesting. And I think that also connects to the whole idea of, even just virginity and how it's like a woman giving a man part of herself. And then when it's a man, I feel like just the way it's discussed is so different, as if a man is taking ownership and it's something to be proud of, but a woman has to be careful of who she gives it to. And it's obviously different for everyone, but I just think the way we talk about it puts so much shame and pressure on women as opposed to men. Is that something you've noticed with your work as well?
Yes, for sure. I mean, right, the whole concept is a complete reflection of the patriarchy, an idea that women have worth that is either high or low based on their sexual status, which has to do with like how well their family or their partner has managed their sexuality. So again, that idea that like her sexuality doesn't belong to her, it belongs to her family, it belongs to her, her husband, and that her sexuality becomes either a source of pride or shame for her entire system. It's like way, way, way too much. And the other thing that concept of virginity does, a construct of virginity, is it again obliterates the experiences of anybody who's LGBTQ plus. Does that mean that if you have not had penetrative sex, penis and vagina sex because you are queer, that then you are a virgin your whole life? Like it's just a strange concept and construct that people end up having feeling. I think the thing I find on like working on a college campus especially is that people will have a lot of feelings about their own status around virginity, right? Like feeling like they lost, they quote unquote lost it too young, or they're ashamed that they haven't lost it yet, or just it's a funny thing. It's like it's a descriptor of an experience, but it masquerades as an entire narrative, an entire story of my worth, of my desirability. So it's another interesting point of inquiry of like, why do I come? What are the forces that made me relate to my own virginity or lack of virginity in these particular ways? Like, what is the story there? And in what way is the story creating shame inside of me? And in what ways is the story creating pride inside of me? And just like noticing where those stories live and what they have to say and which ones we didn't ask for and therefore like need to release back to the world,
Mm-hmm. And so for someone because overall, like you said, everyone has such a different journey and path, and it's not like everyone has their first kiss at this age and loses their virginity at the same time. So for someone who may feel shame because they haven't had their first real, in quotes, relationship yet, or they haven't lost their virginity or had their first kiss, whatever it is, and they may feel behind compared to those around them, what advice would you give to them?
Right. I think the biggest, a word that we use so much in this book is self-compassion. So self-compassion basically means talking to ourselves the way we would talk to a very dear friend. So we are basically, providing color commentary all day long on ourselves, what we're doing, what we're not doing. And so noticing that like inner dialogue is really important, because then we can start to question, like, why am I talking to myself that way? So somebody who feels like they are quote unquote behind, and who's saying, you're behind because you're scared, or you're behind because you're not beautiful, or if you wouldn't be so behind if you lost 10 pounds or made more money, or whatever those stories are, like noticing those stories and replacing them with self-compassion, because self-compassion, then if we're being gentle with ourselves, we can shift towards curiosity. And then there might actually be something like, maybe it is that there is fear of letting somebody get close to us. And now I can go into, okay, so why am I afraid? Well, maybe I'm afraid because I have a really painful story about whatever, my father abandoning our family. And so I'm really, really afraid to let somebody in. And so I keep myself safe by keeping everybody at arm's length and swearing off dating and not even putting myself into that space. Okay, well, now there's something I can work with that actually is interesting and gentle versus like, you're a loser, get over yourself, or, whatever. There's, when we can quiet down the self-critical stuff, we might actually find something that has some gentle possibilities for exploring and healing and growth.
Mm-hmm. I completely agree, really reflecting on those limiting beliefs and where they came from. So overall, the show is about living your most authentic life and being true to yourself. And I think a huge aspect of that is self-awareness, because if you don't know yourself in that way, whether it is sexually, spiritually, emotionally, mentally, in all aspects, then it's hard to really be your best self and live your truth. So I want to ask you now, what does living your most authentic life mean to you?
I think living my most authentic life to me means honoring the yeses versus the nos inside of me, and being okay with the yeses. Sometimes my yeses are inconvenient. They take me away from my family sometimes, or I think to honor what I'm really passionate about. Sometimes I feel like it's hard to hold on to that, plus being the mother I want to be, being the wife I want to be. And so that's something for me. Authenticity is about just being truthful about those conflicts and those tensions, and being gentle with myself about them, knowing that there's not an easy answer, and trusting that I can have conversations with my family about how to be true to me and my work and my passion, while also taking care of them and being connected to them. So that's my authenticity a lot, I think, because I'm, in the years of raising my family, I think for me, authenticity is about just being aware of and honest about those points of conflict and tension, which I don't call it balancing work and family. I just call it like honoring the tensions between the work I love and the family I love.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing all this incredible insight. This is such an important topic, and I agree that we really need to continue this conversation. And so I'm so thankful for your work, and I will make sure to include all your information in the description of this episode, along with a link to your book as well, your new book. And so can you just let us know overall what's coming up next for you and your work, and where can listeners give you a follow?
Sure. The best way to find out more is on my website, dralexandrasolomon.com. And as I was mentioning before, I'm really active on Instagram. That's been a really fun space to kind of grow community and provide daily or almost daily, depending on how my time works, relationship education content. And I've got some e-courses that are coming up, and all that information is on my website. And through my website, you can sign up for my newsletter, which is a great way of finding out about future events, courses that are coming out, and yeah, things that we have going on, articles and events.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Alexandra. I appreciate it.
Have a wonderful day.
I hope you enjoyed that episode. There were so many great takeaways, and I just love the subjects we touched on, and I find so much importance in really self-awareness in general, but especially understanding ourselves and others, and learning more about different aspects of our gender and sexuality that are non-binary. I actually read her new book, Taking Sexy Back, before the interview, so I was ready with questions and I had so much to ask. I specifically was most interested in how she also believes that, when you have a gender reveal, when you have a baby, it's not necessarily a gender reveal. We call it that, it's fine. We have the pink and the blue, whatever people want to do, to each their own. But to be more accurate, it's a sex reveal. It's the sex that's assigned at birth. I just find it really important to be aware of all the expectations we place on each other, especially when it comes to cultural conditioning, where we're taught that boys are a certain way, girls are a certain way, and that limits us as we grow up. These are all societal expectations that we place, especially on babies. We say, oh, and this is nothing against anyone else who chooses to do gender reveal or chooses to raise their kids how they want. This is obviously up to everyone, but it's something to think about, because do we want to limit our kids and keep this pattern? I recently watched this, I guess you can call her influencer that I follow, post about her newborn baby, and she had a gender reveal in her words, and I obviously like her. I follow her. I think it was a cute reveal, but she just posted this after she found out it was a girl biologically with anatomy, a female. She put this whole post about how she can't wait She's excited for the baby to be a fairy and dance with her and play music and do their nails and just all these typical girly girl activities. And I don't want to be like that downer who's like so serious and trying to be politically correct or whatever, but I don't know, I feel like that puts so many expectations already on this child that's not even born, because you can only control what you do. And at the end of the day, if your daughter wants to, I'm not saying like don't let them do stereotypical girl activities or boy activities. If your daughter wants to play with dresses and dolls, let her. If your son wants to play with Legos, let him. But if they also want to try other things out and they want to dip their toes in normal activities that shouldn't be limited to, boys can't play with Barbies, all that. I think we're a little more open-minded these days, but there's still so many limits. Like if my son wants to go get a manicure, pedicure with me, I would love that. I don't ever want to limit my child just because of the sex they were assigned at birth. I've never understood anyone not letting people be themselves, obviously, unless they're harming others and it's something that's really detrimental to a community. If they're not hurting others like physically or, the obvious stuff, then it should not matter to anyone else. And so I very much enjoyed this talk with Alexandra. Please let me know what you've taken away from this episode. I'd love to know. I obviously do not know as much as I should in any way about the LGBTQ plus community and more on this topic. There's so much I'm interested in educating myself on. And if you have any book recommendations, have any podcasts, or just any content I can consume that has to do with this topic specifically, I would love to know. Let me know. You can reach me at Trust and Thrive on Instagram, which is the Instagram for this podcast specifically, or my personal Instagram at tar.mont. You can also follow Alexandra at dr.alexandra.solomon on Instagram. And you can also check out her website, dralexandrasolomon.com. And you should definitely give her new book a listen. I will make sure to include it in the description of this episode. I loved it. So make sure to give it a read. There's so many different topics we touch on. I know at the end of this episode, I was kind of focused on one area, but there are so many different takeaways that were discussed in this interview and so many more that were not. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Let me know what stuck with you. With that said, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week full of self-reflection, and I will catch you all next Thrive Thursday.